Hey everyone, welcome to the Renovation Theory podcast. In this podcast and in our Facebook group, we're working to build a community that's focused on breaking down barriers and walls through authentic conversations. And we hope to do that through this podcast and our Facebook group that we've got going. And we are your hosts. I'm Pat, and this is Britt.
Hey, everybody. Today we're going to jump into an issue that, again, has kind of been in the news a lot lately. We're going to talk a little bit about protests. So covering everything from, again, kind of the role of sports in that, and because that's kind of the biggest place that we see protests, but then how that kind of trickles down and we see that entering consumer life and how we spend our money and spend our time.
Protesting has been something that has always happened in our society. America is built on peaceful protests and protesting for what you believe in and change and everything. But I feel like recently, within the past few years, maybe it's just social media. We could talk about that here in this episode, but I feel like protesting and boycotting have maybe not gotten out of hand, but been magnified.
Definitely magnified.
And it's provided, social media and just technology, I think, has just provided us a way to boycott and protest in new ways. Some probably less productive.
Probably.
Some that allow us to be more lazy when we protest.
Totally.
But right out of the gate, we should, we can't do an episode on protest right now without mentioning Colin Kaepernick. And that was, as you and I were talking before this episode, the whole Nike commercial campaign using Colin Kaepernick recently is kind of the impetus for this episode. And for this episode, we're not going to get into the race issue that Colin Kaepernick was originally protesting and boycotting, and we don't really want to get into the patriotism or the flag representation. We just want to talk about protests in general. Those are other topics that are valuable, and we will have conversations around those. But for this episode, we want to rein it into protests in general, but using the Colin Kaepernick situation, fiasco, depending on what side of it you're on. As kind of our jumping off point.
Sure.
So to start it, Colin Kaepernick basically started this whole thing in the 2016 NFL season by taking a knee during the national anthem. And he was...
Just to pause for a second, as far as a lot of people who've entered this conversation is concerned, that's when it started. I think there's some history behind that we're also not going to get into, but to be aware that this is actually a conversation that's been going on for a long time, but as far as a lot of people have entered into it, that's how it started.
Sure. Yep, that's a good point. And so that started in the 2016 NFL season, and he was let go by his team at the end of that season and hasn't been a player in the NFL since then, and that's a whole nother slew of issues. But his protest was originally about treatment of minorities, specifically Black African-American people in America, and he couldn't stand behind the flag as that happened. So his protest was political, social, cultural in nature. But I think where we want to spend most of our episode today is talking about the maybe counter protests or the protests that have kind of spun off from that, as well as other protests in the past several years with businesses and stuff, and how that affects more of our society and as far as consumerism goes.
Right.
So NFL is obviously a business. And so since the 2016 season, they've tried to approach the subject with varying degrees of success, or should I say varying degrees of failure.
That's probably more likely.
Probably more like it. We were just looking up some articles, and the subtitle of one of these articles is there's no easy fix for a league with a majority of Black players and a mostly white audience. And that extends to the NFL executives, which are mostly white as well. And so there's no easy fix for that part of it. But what that's spawned is a lot of protests and declining viewership for the NFL because of this. And throughout the 2017 season, that was a big sticking point. Announcers were talking about it during TV broadcasts, and the day after or even the day of, there were articles being written on which players kneeled and which players stood, and it became a gigantic issue that actually caused the NFL to lose some money, lose some TV ratings, and the networks lost some ratings as well.
Well, I do think it's an interesting issue because I think there probably are some news outlets that are the ones that are reporting on this that can get behind the original intent of why Colin Kaepernick started doing this. And so
I don't want to not address that right now because I don't think it's not an issue. That is definitely an issue to be discussed at a later point, and I'm not downplaying that issue. That's just not the focus of our podcast.
No, I'm just saying, I think, it's hard to separate them because they do affect each other ultimately. Right. The more that it gets reported on, the more people see that, and the more it's constantly in their frame of mind, and the more, if you're on the other side of that issue, if you think that's not a correct way to express that opinion, the more you see that, the more frustrated by it you get, and the bigger of an issue it turns into, and the more likely you are to not watch NFL games. So there's this interesting cycle of people who are on one side of this issue, or agree with what's happening, or just want to be reporting on what's happening, that they see that as an issue that's newsworthy, and so they're reporting on it. And there's this frequency that you were mentioning, and then that kind of meets people who disagree with it and feel imposed upon by it and feel like they're being pressed against all the time with this message that they, for whatever reason, whether it be the patriotism or whatever, they don't agree with how that's being expressed. And it's creating this void of like, well, we don't want to talk about it. We don't want to come in contact with this. We want more space from this issue. And so the only way for us to get that is to not watch these games, or that's how they feel.
Right. And then it most recently came up again because Nike decided to run an ad campaign featuring Colin Kaepernick.
Right.
And so that, of course, brought the issue to the forefront again.
Right.
And there's been a lot of reaction on both sides from people supporting Nike for doing this and for people not supporting Nike for doing this. And immediately after, so they ran the campaign. They ran the TV spot for the first time during an NFL game, too, which good for Nike.
Right.
But that obviously just inflamed the situation even more. And speaking of inflaming, that led to people burning their Nikes.
Well, I think this is an interesting time that we live in because I've often felt a little bit of a push myself around companies feeling like they need to get involved in a social political way. Like, Oreo made a statement, Apple's made many statements, and Chick-fil-A makes a different statement. And, I think there's a way to do that gracefully, but then I also feel like there's a way that it's like, why does Oreos need to have an opinion? But that's just part of social media and the way that we expect brands to interact and how we want them to reinvest their money in what they're doing. And so it is an interesting piece, but I think it also does create a really interesting, like now you have to pick brands that, they're not, we don't define them this way, but is this a Republican brand or a Democratic brand? Like that's not the way we would talk about it, but I feel like we're getting to that point where it's like, well,
and it does affect our decision making on some level.
Sure.
I mean, even if they haven't come out with an explicit statement on something, if they donate money to a certain cause or don't donate money to a certain cause, that affects our buying decisions.
I know, but it's interesting because it used to be not very long ago that if I wanted to put my dollar votes to something, it was what is the best thing for that dollar. And now there's a lot to be said around branding, and Nike has always had a brand that has a cool factor to it, and not necessarily like luxury, but it's definitely like a quality brand, So we've had that piece, but then to be also adding in like, what if I'm wearing Nike, what statements am I making? And there have been other brands that I can think of that like as I grew up that were specifically for like made to represent a certain group of people or fit with stereotypes. I was thinking of, I think it was FUBU. I don't know if you're familiar. It's Forest Bias, and that was specifically created for the Black community and was originally created for that group of people. And then you saw that group of people wearing them, and then it became cool, and then it was, now we're getting into a little bit of cultural appropriation. Yep. And what that means. And so anyways, big pot that we're stirring right now. But just talking about that idea of, what statements are people making by burning, cutting the Nike logo off of their socks and burning their shoes and then posting them to social media a lot of times.
We both kind of eye roll at that.
Yeah, I definitely do eye roll at that.
It's just it's six of one, half dozen of the other in this issue for me, because we're talking about an issue that started because of a protest.
Right.
A protest over an issue that we all need to be made more aware of and work towards fixing.
Yeah.
And then once you get past that statement is where all of the mess happens. How do we make that happen? Is it, how big of an issue? Is it really blah, blah, blah? But then we get to the point where people are cutting the Nike logos out of their shoes or burning their shoes, and we eye roll about it. Why?
Well,
part of me says, why is that not okay? Like, I eye roll at it because I'm like, what are you doing? You paid $200 for these Nike shoes, and you are just burning them because they chose a spokesperson who is an athlete.
Right.
But at the same time, like, you're making a statement, just like Colin Kaepernick was making a statement.
And I think there's some validity to what you're saying. Like, you should be able to make a counter statement. We need to be able to do that. But at the same time, the fact that these are now on the same level with each other because of the space that they've been given is where it really gets to me. Like, your platform is that you want to burn your Nikes, and his platform is that he feels like he's had like systematic like discrimination because of who he is as a person. And I think that's where it starts to get really blurry, because I do feel like there are people who feel like they are being discriminated is definitely not the right word, but that their way of life is being challenged because they so supremely believe in America and what it is. So I think underneath a few layers, there's a root message that people feel like is being challenged, but at the core, at the front of it, to me, is I'm throwing like what I see as a person who is not on really any side of, like, I don't have any emotional reaction to the Nike commercial. I just see people burning stuff they already paid for. And then on top of that, posting about it, which to me is free publicity for the company that you are supposed to be boycotting. Yep. And it's working for Nike, not against Nike. So
I just saw an article, and we'll put it in our show notes, from CNN. In the couple days after the Nike ad first ran, maybe first week, they gained something like close to 150,000 Twitter followers or Instagram followers, and their stocks were up. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's still too early to tell if that really affected profits really in any way, but it...
Well, but I mean, a lot of times that publicity does, and but I think that's something that we don't think through as consumers a lot of times, is like, okay, well, I want to stand against something or make a protest, but what, you've heard countless stories like this where a certain group of people is going to boycott something and it totally does the opposite for the company that that's supposed to be hurting,
Chick-fil-A is the first example that comes to my mind. What was it, like 2012, I think it was, 2013 maybe. The owner made a few comments about LGBT. Mm-hmm. What were the specific comments? Oh, they were supporting organizations that LGBT activists decried as supporting organizations that discriminated against them.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a big protest for Chick-fil-A,
Mm-hmm.
and people were siding on one side and saying, I'm boycotting Chick-fil-A, I'm never eating there again.
Mm-hmm.
And just like to your point, an equal amount of people supported them,
right,
and bought food from Chick-fil-A, and it didn't hurt them.
Right.
Their stock price rose, their profits went up.
Right.
And I mean, from then on, they kind of downplayed that issue and wanted to move on. And that's, kind of back to the other point, like, do they have to have a stance on that?
Right.
As a company, maybe not, but in today's society, maybe they do.
Right.
But they tried to move on from it, and it hasn't, as far as I know, been a big issue since then.
Right. I mean, and I think, brands, being a marketer, I can imagine as a brand, you probably don't want to be in the middle of that for very long. And so there's definitely some wisdom, I think, into downplaying that. But, I think there's this really unique situation that we have with social media, which you kind of mentioned, where we as individuals have so much of a bigger voice, but also like we can broadcast is so many, but then also we're still such a small piece in the bigger picture. And so anyways, I was thinking earlier when you were talking about protests and how I think one of the things that we definitely see now with protests is there's this ability for there to be all these even segmented protests, because you can find your people that are protesting the same thing that you're protesting. Whereas I feel like when I think back on American history and some of the protests that have happened, it's these bigger, when they start to get news press, they were at a much different state than, who knows, a couple thousand people burn their Nikes, but because we have access to that information, that snowballs a lot faster, I think. And because of that, we see sort of these almost flash protests, I would maybe call them, sure. Of how long is this Nike stuff really going to last? A couple of weeks, maybe. You could see that happening in a positive way with the ice bucket challenge, which wasn't a protest, but the, sort of the opposite of that, where. Oh yeah.
It's the same mentality,
right,
for supporting organizations. Right. And that even goes back to the companies need to have a voice on certain things, because you support companies that do good things. Tom Shoes, Warby Parker glasses, a lot of those companies that are, the buy one, give one, or so much of this, our profits go towards this cause that we believe in. And by supporting that brand, by buying that brand, it goes back to what you were saying earlier. You are kind of known for that.
Right.
And then they become cool, and then it's
right. But then it's going to turn, I feel like it's going to turn into this thing where it's conservative people who believe in this support these brands, and more, left-leaning people support these brands, because that's how we segment, or we feel like we have to segment what we buy. And I think there's pros and cons to that. Obviously a lot of amazing things have come out of brands that do the buy one, give one, and things like that.
Or the hashtag activism sort of stuff, the ice bucket challenge, right, or anything else.
Yeah, they got a ton of money for that. And I mean, those are great causes to support. But it complicates our relationships with brands even further, which they already are not uncomplicated, I would say, as somebody who kind of understands the background and sure. Some of the manipulation's a little heavy, but
how the sausage is made.
Yeah, yeah. So that's one of the things that I was really thinking about as we were preparing for this episode was, why is it that we are okay with athletes or just people in any sort of power platform, with a platform of any kind? We're okay with them, using that platform for things that we agree with. So whether that be there's a lot of people that support different illnesses. We were just talking about ALS, or, they create foundations, or like
so many athletes and celebrities have their own foundations.
Yeah, like Play 360, and like there's just a bunch of these organizations. And I think we sort of see that almost as like an expectation of like, if we're going to pay you all these millions of dollars, you should do something good with them, whether or not we think about it that way consciously. But then we have to be okay with people putting that effort toward things we disagree with. And I think that that's not something that we think about a lot of times.
Does that extend to brands too, or are you just talking
endorsements? I think it should have to, right? Okay. I mean, if we're going to give people the opportunity to support things, it's just not going to be possible for us to always agree on them. I mean, and when we're talking about like cancer foundations and stuff like that, there are not people don't look down on that, because it's not like you're going to be like, well, I think you should have a ALS foundation instead of a cancer foundation. Like, all of that we see as good. But when it starts to be attached to things that are like socially or politically oriented, then we don't always agree on those issues. And so then we start to villainize the person who's bringing light to those issues, which I think is really interesting. But I also think it's really interesting in the sense of like, okay, so let's say I don't agree with what Colin Kaepernick decided to do, but then I feel like it's okay should I be able to think it's okay for somebody to stand on The Voice and talk about their faith and what God's done for them, and how like, can we really say that one of those is okay and one of them is not okay? Like, why do we get the power to decide just because it's something that we agree with, or it doesn't like push our bubble or make us uncomfortable, that it's okay? I think
where do we draw the line between, or is there a line to be drawn between supporting someone as an athlete, or The Voice case as a singer, supporting their voice, and supporting them off the field or off the stage, whatever. So,
or not. I mean, can't I respect somebody as an athlete and not agree with what they think? I mean, and I think we see that all the time. Like, if somebody is an amazing singer on The Voice, but they have Muslim faith and want to talk about that on TV, should that negate my thinking that they have an amazing voice? But for some reason, when that issue is, in that case, like in the case of the NFL, they're getting paid a lot of money. And so then for some reason that complicates the issues for us. And I don't know, it just turns into this thing where I feel like because it's gray, there's so many double standards. And I just think it's really interesting.
I think another point to be made is we pick one thing to discount a whole person.
Yeah.
Whether we're talking about an athlete or a celebrity. Celebrities do this all the time, and then they make one comment anti something somebody on Facebook, wants to say, and all of a sudden they've discounted this entire celebrity's existence.
Right.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that may be a little bit of an extreme example, but I know people who have not gone to see movies because of a certain celebrity made a comment about such and such social issue or political issue or support such and such brand. We pick one thing to discount everything else. And it's that brings me back to the line in Pirates of the Caribbean.
The classic.
Brings me back to, like, we talk about this all the time. Sarcasm. Anyway, but when Captain Jack Sparrow's getting arrested, he makes the statement about one bad thing being enough to condemn a man,
right? Even
though he's done a bunch other good things, or
sure,
I don't remember the exact line. I probably shouldn't bring up movie quotes if I don't know the actual quote. But it's the same thing.
It's interesting though, because when you were talking about that, I started thinking about, well, okay, so if I don't agree with everything from an actor, should that be grounds for me to watch a movie? I don't know. I mean, probably not. But then let's take Harvey Weinstein for an example of somebody that, should I support a movie that he was a producer on and continue to give him revenue? And that's a...
At this point, you're not giving him any revenue,
wow.
But that's a, a dilemma.
Right. Or, you pick any person in that, and I'm bringing up a whole other discussion. We're just digging up all the discussions today. But how, that's a fine line too. Like, disagreeing with their beliefs versus their actions.
Sure.
And that's a whole, we could go on another 30-minute tangent about that too.
And that, I mean, getting back to the brands thing and celebrities and athletes, that's what we're doing. Like, we support their actions in A and B. A being their sports ability,
right?
Their ability to play their sport, and B being their charitable things. So we support A and B, but then as soon as C comes where we disagree, then we discount all of that to the detriment of not them. They don't, right. I mean, they're not doing this charitable thing because you're supporting them. Mm-hmm. They're not doing this charitable thing because people have asked them to do it. They're doing it in most cases because it's something that's affected them personally, and they have been given a platform to do something about it.
Right.
So it's something that it's an illness that they've experienced in their family, or it's a cause that their best friend started, or something like that. And so they're supporting it because they have the platform to do it. And a lot of times I feel like these arguments for not supporting athletes or celebrities, or getting mad at them for saying this, like, you stick to doing movies and don't say anything political. Mm-hmm. I do not like it when people say that, because you're doing the same thing by saying that. Right. What if the celebrity replied to you and said, "No, you just stick to your marketing." Right. And leave the politics to the politicians.
You just do your desk job. Right.
We do the same things. We just don't like it when they say things that disagree with what we're saying.
Right.
But the question I guess I'm getting to in a very roundabout way is, what are we trying to accomplish when we do these protests, or when we do discount such and such celebrity or athlete for doing such a thing?
Right.
Like, or burning our Nikes, and that's kind of why we rolled our eyes at the beginning. Like, what are you doing? Right. What are you trying to accomplish here?
Well, I think, one of the things I was just thinking about was, I don't know what it is about these positions of, like, being in front of, like, a platform, or, having a stage or whatever, but we want people to be really one-dimensional. Like, you're just a football player, and that's the only thing that you are good, that's how I put you in your box, right? But it's kind of like saying, like, I'm not going to be friends with you anymore because you don't like macaroni and cheese. Like, it's one thing about a person, and granted, a lot of the stances that they're making are big pieces around who they are. Colin Kaepernick's stance is because of his cultural, racial, political upbringing as a person. So it is obviously much more important than macaroni and cheese. But it is still just a piece of who he is and a piece of what he brings. And I think, to me, it kind of comes back to this idea of, like, is it just that we're not okay with being uncomfortable? And I think that that's something that we see more and more, is, like, this idea of, like, I just want to be in my little zone, and I don't want people to disagree with me, and I don't want people to challenge me, and I don't want to have friends that challenge the way I think, or, and that's a lot of why we created this, or trying to create this group, because I think we need to get more comfortable with disagreeing and not having our initial response be, well, I'm just going to cut that out of my life, because eventually we're just going to be all of us in our own cabins in the woods everywhere, if we always want to agree with everybody about everything. I mean,
at least digitally in cabins in the woods,
right? Maybe
not physically, but
well, I mean, yeah, I mean, how do you truly get separation from that, even digitally, So I think, as much as social media is really great in the sense of it can bring, like, I've heard so many cool stories of people finding, like, their people, like super nerdy subreddit group or,
or causes, even getting back to the causes thing, finding and amplifying causes.
Or in the LGBT community, like if you live in a small town and you can find some other people to identify with and have that conversation. So it's so interesting because I think for all the amazing things that have come out of it, there's just as many just sort of terrifying, horrible, like pull us apart kind of things. And I think we're getting worse and worse and worse at facing those things. And that's kind of scary.
And so we just kind of retreat back into our comfort zone, which is with our group of people that agree with us. And so that's when the burning of the Nikes happens, when you've got your group of people that are not happy with Nike running a Colin Kaepernick ad, and so you burn your Nikes, and it becomes a thing on social media.
Right.
I think you've hit on a really good thing about we just don't like to be pushed. We don't like to be pressed against something that we've actually got to think about why we believe what we believe.
Right.
No matter what the issue is. And then at least in today's society, the way we lash out is by posting something on social media or unfriending somebody on social media, unfollowing somebody. And that's how we do it. And then we just further entrench ourselves in our own little bubble or cabin in the woods.
Yeah. We have a lot of power. Like,
we all have a platform.
Right. Right. And it's
it
obviously
may be 300 people on Facebook, unlike, athlete who's got millions of people, but
it's interesting, talking about we all have a platform because, I've got tons of anecdote stories about people who've written negative reviews on Yelp or Google and gotten some kind of response because of that. And so it just fits into that same idea of like we have this expectation of like how a brand should respond. Otherwise, I'm going to give them a 1 star. And so we just have this, it's just such a fascinating interchange between brands and people, and then celebrities too, and how that kind of fits into the whole conversation. But I do think, there's a lot to be said about like asking yourself, like, why am I responding to something? Like even in a situation where it's like you're going to go write a negative Google review, like, was I hungry? Was I stressed out for some reason? Like there's, while it is the brand's responsibility to own up to certain things, I think there's so many people that they default to, and I think we're so used to being treated as though I'm the most important thing in the situation. And so I'm going to act out as though I'm the most important thing in the situation.
If I wasn't catered to exactly how I wanted to be catered to.
Right. And it fits into that conversation that we were having about how we don't like being uncomfortable. We don't like waiting in line. We don't like somebody disagreeing with us. We don't like the brand to disagree with us. And so I just think it's something to think about as we kind of continue these conversations of, what are those triggers for you, and what are the things that are making you react the way you react, and is it true and valid and good, and is there a reason why you react that way, or is it just because I don't like to feel uncomfortable, or I want to be right, or I don't want to be inconvenienced?
And if you are going to take action, what is that action going to do?
Right.
Like, is it actually going to help? Like 1-star reviews on Google or Yelp, as in the marketing world, I'm not a fan of them just because I feel like a lot of them are, like you said, somebody kind of throwing a fit. But if it's a valid, necessary thing, like this is a business that really needs to be called out and other people need to know about it, yeah. Mm-hmm. But evaluate the action that you're taking. What is it actually doing? Right.
Like I was in Chipotle a while ago and I don't know the situation of what happened. I was backwards in the line a little bit and this guy just like literally started berating the person at Chipotle. And I just stood there not knowing the context of the situation at all, just asking myself, like, is there any reason why you're Chipotle bowl is this important that you should be berating somebody. And there maybe could be a situation where that is true, but I highly doubt it. And just
I can't really think of one. And working in customer service, working as a server in a restaurant, I can remember instances where I've had something like that happen to me, and it's sad.
Yeah. So, there's a ton of little nuances to this conversation in different places that plays out, both on a huge scale and a really small scale. But I think, it's again, something we'd love to have your opinions on and your thoughts on.
Yeah. And that's why we created the Facebook group. So the link to the Facebook group will be in the show notes on this episode, or you can just head over to facebook.com and search for Renovation Theory. We've created a group, and we're really working hard on creating a safe place, a safe community for these discussions to happen.
Right.
We want you to get involved with us and with other people and having these same conversations and really exploring what impact we're making with our actions, or in the protest issue specifically, if we're going to protest something, make it worthwhile and actually make it
thoughtful,
count for something if it needs to count for something. Otherwise, take a deep breath and not do anything. But lots of questions, lots of little things that came up today. We will post questions throughout the week on the Facebook group, so feel free to jump over there and join the conversation and throw your 2 cents in there. But keep in mind our core values, and that we want to have quality, authentic conversations and value everybody. So thank you for listening or watching. If you've done that, if you've made it this far, we really appreciate you. If you haven't subscribed on YouTube or on your podcast player, please subscribe so that you get your episode of Renovation Theory every single week on Thursday when we publish it. And if you're liking what you're hearing, we'd really appreciate it if you could go and leave a rating or review, preferably more than a 1-star rating. On iTunes. That'll help us out and just let us know how we're doing and everything.
If you're going to leave us a 1-star rating, we'd love to have a conversation with you first.
Yes. But yeah, we publish new episodes every single week, so we will see you next week.